All right, so picture this. You wake up after a big storm, the wind and the rain have stopped, but outside it's a mess. Trees are down everywhere. Branches are scattered all over the place.
Yeah, it's kind of like a disaster movie, huh?
It really is. It can be overwhelming and maybe a little scary too.
Hmm.
But that's why we're doing this deep dive today. We found a podcast episode all about how to handle fallen trees safely.
Oh, that's smart. There's so much to think about after a storm, it's easy to forget about safety.
Exactly. And that's the first thing this podcast talks about, staying safe. It might seem obvious, but when you're dealing with all the damage, it's easy to let your guard down.
Yeah, you're kind of running on adrenaline and you just want to start cleaning up.
Right. But the podcast really emphasizes that the most dangerous thing after a storm is downed power lines.
Oh, yeah, those are scary. They can be hard to see, and you definitely don't want to mess with them.
The podcast actually calls them invisible killers.
Wow, that's a good way to put it.
They really stress the importance of calling the utility company right away and letting the pros handle it.
Makes sense. They have the training and the equipment to deal with that kind of danger.
Definitely. So down power lines are a big no-no. But the podcast also talks about all these other hidden dangers that can pop up after a storm.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples. I'm all ears.
Well, for one thing, storm-damaged trees can be really unpredictable.
Oh, yeah, I can see
Yeah.
that. Like a branch that looks fine but is actually ready to snap.
Exactly. You might have branches that are partially split or a tree trunk that looks solid, but is actually weakened at the base.
So it's not just about the trees that have already fallen, it's the ones that are still standing too.
The podcast compares it to walking through a minefield. You never know what's lurking beneath the surface.
Ooh, that's a good analogy. So what's the first step then once you've kind of gotten over the initial shock of the storm damage?
Well, podcast says it's all about assessment. You really need to take stock of the situation before you do anything. Figure out where the fallen trees are. Are they on your roof? Are they blocking the driveway? Or even worse, are they leaning against your house?
So different locations are going to require different approaches, makes sense.
They actually tell a story about a homeowner in Florida who ignored a tree that was leaning against a power line.
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
He thought it was fine, no big deal, until boom, the tree took down the power line, caused a massive blackout in the neighborhood, and ended up costing him a ton of money in repairs.
Ouch. So ignoring the problem definitely wasn't the right move.
Not at all. And what's even crazier is that according to the podcast, the homeowner had known about the leaning tree for weeks before the storm, but just never did anything about it.
That's a good reminder that we tend to put things off until it's too late. Out of sight, out of mind.
It's true. And it highlights the importance of being proactive, which we'll definitely talk about later. But
Yeah.
okay, let's say you've surveyed the damage, and thankfully there are no downed power lines near you now. Comes the big question, DIY or call a pro?
The classic dilemma, I feel like everyone struggles with this.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
But luckily the podcast gives some pretty clear guidelines on how to make that decision.
Okay, so lay it on me. When is DIY a good option?
Well, we say if you're just dealing with small branches that are already lying flat on the ground and you can easily reach them with hand tools, you're probably good to go on your own.
So like those branches that always end up in your gutters after a storm.
Exactly. That's totally DIY territory. But they're very clear that calling in professionals is a must when you're dealing with larger trees, especially anything that's partially uprooted, leaning on structures, or requires chainsaws or climbing gear.
Right, you don't want to risk getting hurt or making the situation worse.
Exactly. It's all about knowing your limits and not being afraid to ask for help when you need it.
And the pros have the experience, the tools, and the insurance to handle those tricky situations safely.
Exactly. But here's where the podcast gets really interesting. They actually suggest that even if you think you can handle it yourself, it might be worth having a certified arborist come out for an evaluation.
Wait, even for a DIY situation,
No.
why is that?
Because arborists are trained to spot things that we might miss. They can assess the structural integrity of the tree, look for hidden damage or decay, and basically give you that peace of mind that you're not missing something crucial.
Oh, that makes sense. It's like having a doctor for your trees.
Exactly. They have that expert eye that can see potential problems before they become major issues, and sometimes that expert opinion can save you from making costly mistakes.
So they're basically saying it's better to be safe than sorry.
Exactly. The podcast even tells a story about a homeowner who thought he could handle a large branch that was hanging over his shed.
Oh, this is where it goes wrong, isn't it?
Yep, he misjudged the weight of the branch and it ended up causing even more damage when it came crashing down. It not only damaged his shed, but also took out a chunk of his fence.
Ouch, that's got to be frustrating and expensive.
It was a classic case of good intentions gone wrong and a strong argument for letting the pros handle those tricky situations.
Okay, so we've talked about assessing the situation, recognizing those hidden dangers, and deciding whether to DIY or call in a pro. What's next?
Well, let's say for now that we've decided to tackle this ourselves. What does the podcast recommend for handling those fallen trees safely and efficiently? I'm ready for the next lesson.
All right, let's dive in.
All right, so we're ready to get our hands dirty. What's the first step?
Well, before you even think about picking up a saw, the podcast really stresses the importance of gearing up properly.
Okay, so we're not just talking about throwing on some old gardening gloves.
Nope. They recommend sturdy work gloves that can protect your hands from cuts and splinters, and boots with good ankle support to prevent slips and falls.
Makes sense. It's easy to twist an ankle when you're walking on uneven ground.
Exactly. And of course, don't forget about eye protection.
Oh, right. Safety goggles.
Yep. You don't want sawdust or flying debris getting in your eyes.
So it's like suiting up for battle. You wouldn't charge into a dangerous situation without the right protection.
That's a great way to put it. Now, once you're all geared up, it's time to choose the right tools for the job.
Okay, so what are we talking about here?
Well, for smaller branches, a handsaw should be sufficient. But if you're dealing with anything larger, you might need a chainsaw.
Chainsaws kind of scare me, to be honest.
I hear you.
Yeah.
They can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing.
The podcast actually mentions that chainsaw accidents spike after storms.
Yeah, it makes sense. People are in a hurry to clean up and they might not be thinking clearly.
So if you're not comfortable using a chainsaw, it's definitely best to leave it to the pros.
Absolutely. Okay, so you've got your safety gear, you've chosen your tools, and you're ready to start cutting. What's next?
Let's do this.
Hold on there, partner. The podcast really emphasizes that this isn't just about hacking away at random.
Oh, so there's a strategy involved.
There is. It's about cutting strategically to control where those branches fall and avoid any nasty surprises.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do we do that?
Well, they suggest starting by lightening the load, so tackling those smaller branches first to make the larger sections more manageable.
Kind of like taking apart a puzzle piece by piece.
Exactly. It's not about brute force, it's about breaking down the task into smaller, more controllable steps.
I like that approach.
Yeah.
So we start with the smaller branches and then work our way up to the bigger stuff.
Right. And when it comes to making those cuts, the podcast has another interesting tip. Always cut at an angle.
At an angle, I never would have thought of that. Why is that so important?
Well, they explain that it helps to control where the branch falls, preventing it from getting stuck or splintering in weird ways.
Oh, that makes sense.
And it also helps to prevent the branch from tearing off bark from the trunk as it falls, which can damage the tree and make it more susceptible to disease.
Wow, I'm learning so much.
Yeah.
So it's not just about getting the branch down. It's about doing it in a way that's safe for both you and the tree.
Exactly. Those small details can make a big difference. Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. You've carefully and strategically cut down all the branches, and now you've got a mountain of debris in your yard.
All right, time for the cleanup, which is always my least favorite part.
I hear you, but it's just as important as the cutting itself. The podcast recommends chopping those branches into manageable pieces, kind of like firewood size, so they're easier to transport and dispose of.
Okay, it makes sense.
And don't forget to check with your local waste service about their pickup options.
Oh, right. Some towns have specific rules about yard waste.
Exactly. And while you're at it, you might want to ask about their composting or mulching programs.
That's a great idea. Turn that debris into something useful.
Exactly. All right, one last safety tip before we move on.
Okay, lay it on me.
Never work alone.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. It's easy to get caught up in the task and forget that you might need help.
Exactly. Having someone nearby can make a big difference. They can act as a spotter, help you lift heavy branches, and most importantly, call for help if something goes wrong.
So safety in numbers.
Always. Okay, so we've covered safety gear, choosing the right tools, strategic cutting, and safe cleanup practices. What's next on our post-storm checklist?
Well, before we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to talk about prevention. Dealing with a fallen tree is stressful enough. Wouldn't it be great to minimize that risk in the first place?
I'm all for that.
The podcast actually has a whole segment on prevention, and I'm really curious to hear what they have to say. I'm thinking more along the lines of documenting the damage, for insurance purposes.
Ah, yes. The not so fun part, but definitely important. The podcast really stresses that taking photos and keeping good records can make a huge difference if you need to file a claim.
Okay, so what exactly should we be taking pictures of?
Everything. The fallen trees, any damage to your property, the surrounding area before you start clearing anything away, It's like creating a visual timeline of the damage.
I see. So it's like proof, right? If you say a tree fell in your garage, but you don't have a photo to show it, it's your word against the insurance companies.
Exactly. And they also recommend keeping a written log of everything you do, the date and time you discover the damage, the steps you took to prevent further damage, any contact you have with contractors or insurance adjusters.
Sounds a bit like homework, but I guess it's better to be safe than sorry.
Absolutely. And speaking of insurance, the podcast reminds us to double check our policies. Some policies cover storm-related tree removal, especially if there's damage to your house.
It's one of those things you never think about until you need it.
Right, but it's important to know what you're covered for before disaster strikes.
Okay, so we've got photos, we've got our logs. What else do we need to know?
Well, if you decide to hire professionals, always make sure they are licensed and insured.
Ah, that's a good point. You don't want just anyone with a chainsaw showing up at your door.
Exactly. Having that insurance protects both you and the contractor if something goes wrong.
Speaking of things going wrong, the podcast actually tells a story about a homeowner who had a tree fall on his garage.
Oh no, what happened?
Well, he was so focused on cleaning up the mess that he didn't take any photos of the damage.
Oh, that was his first mistake.
It was when he filed his insurance claim, the adjuster denied it because there wasn't enough evidence to prove the damage was caused by the storm.
That's terrible. So even though he had a legitimate claim, he ended up having to pay for everything himself.
Yep, it's a tough lesson to learn, but it highlights how important that documentation really is.
It definitely does. Okay, so we've covered safety DIY versus pro insurance documentation. It's been a lot.
It has, but I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. But before we wrap up, I'd love to touch on prevention.
Yes, preventing those trees from falling in the first place.
Exactly. The podcast has a whole segment on this, and it's full of great advice.
Okay, so how do we keep those trees from becoming a hazard during the next storm?
Well, they start by emphasizing regular tree inspections.
So it's not just a plant it and forget it kind of thing.
Nope. They actually recommend getting into the habit of checking your trees for dead branches, leaning trunks, or any signs of rot or decay, ideally, before storm season hits.
So it's like a checkup for your trees.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay, so regular inspections are key.
Yeah.
What else can we do?
They also talk about strategic pruning, so trimming branches away from your house power lines and even your neighbor's property.
So it's about creating a safe zone around those potential hazards.
Exactly. And finally, they stress the importance of investing in tree health.
So we're not just hacking away at branches, we're actually taking care of them.
Right. It's about creating the best possible environment for your trees to thrive. So regular watering, mulching around the base of the tree, and fertilizing.
I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
It's all about being proactive.
It is. And the podcast actually shares a story about a family who invested in pruning and bracing their large oak tree.
Okay.
And it managed to weather a Category 2 hurricane with minimal damage, while their neighbors, who hadn't taken any preventative measures, lost several trees and had significant damage to their property.
Wow, that's pretty convincing.
It is. It shows that a little bit of effort can go a long way.
Well, this has been a whirlwind of information. I feel like I've gone from feeling completely overwhelmed to having a clear plan of action.
Me too. We've covered so much ground, from recognizing those hidden dangers to the importance of documentation to even preventing trees from falling in the first place.
It's been an amazing deep dive, and I hope our listeners are feeling a lot more prepared for the next storm.
Me too. And if you've had any experiences with fallen trees or have any tips to share, we'd love to hear from you.
Leave us a comment or send us an email. We're always up for a good tree story. And until next time, stay safe out there.